Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Joan Crate, whom I'm reading out of Native Poetry in Canada. So a lot of Crate's poetry really revolves around these sort of composite models of Indigenous suffering. That is, they're not necessarily the representative experiences of any single individual, but they represent these sort of broad strands of suffering, dispossession, silencing, oppression, etc., typically, but not always, connected with gender, but certainly functioning within the context of settler colonialism and capitalism, which, along multiple matrices, exploits pretty much everyone, but exploits Indigenous people in particular, and often exploits them as Indigenous people specifically through exoticization, tokenization, through sort of social constructs of Indigenous values, ethos, tradition, history, culture, etc., etc. So Crate has lived in a bunch of different places. She's been exposed to a bunch of different First Nations, Native American, Inuit, and Métis cultures. And so she has this sort of composite mindset that really is reflected in her poetry and in I think, very striking ways. So the first one I'm going to read you is the first one in this collection, called The Poetry Reading. By the way, the first two that I'm going to read you each also have a performance element, which is part of the whole exploitation of Indigenous people as Indigenous people, right? Because one, I swear I will get to the poem, but one problematic element of contemporary Canadian culture, and we have the same kind of thing here in the US, but it tends to work along different sort of matrices, is tokenization and essentialization of Indigenous writers, performers, dramatists, etc., etc. There is simultaneously a sort of liberal push to incorporate more Indigenous voices, and I would also say this is actually fairly liberal, but liberal not necessarily in the sense that like conservatives talk about it, but liberal in the sense of like trying to find a sort of cultural middle ground, right, between the politics of the right and the politics of the left. So a sort of centrist position, I guess. There is a presumption and an expectation of Indigenous artists that they will be authentic Indigenous artists. And so again, there are these sets of expectations imposed on Indigenous performers, writers, speakers, dramatists, intellectuals, etc., etc. Basically, any Indigenous person in public life is sort of implicitly expected to reflect not even their cultural values, but the cultural values of Indigenous people as conceptualized by settler colonialism. So that's a very long sort of preface to this, but these first two that I'm going to read you are very much about performance and the imposition of ideas and suffering on Indigenous people within cultural contexts that demand particular types of performance. This first one is actually less overt about it. The second one that I'm going to read you is more overt about it, but they're both thematically linked in that way. So finally, we get there. The first poem I'm going to read, The Poetry Reading. Tonight let me tell you of a world swallowed in one quick gulp, with only crumbs remaining, while in one stale memory corner, a small girl shivers on the steps of a tar paper shack. Her daydreams are bruises behind her eyes, oozing songs of suicide, children mouth in her unfinished womb. So, I mean, again, we've got this sort of idea of like, the title really introduces this central idea more than the poem itself, the idea of the poetry reading, right? It is inherently a performance. And what we get in this, in the content of the poem itself, is the suffering of an Indigenous girl, right? She is poor, she is cold, she is bruised, her dreams are beyond her reach, potentially suicidal, children mouth in her unfinished womb, right? So sexual violence is incredibly common among Indigenous women and girls, unfortunately. And so what we have is a shift of expectations, a turn in what we might reasonably expect, right? If we have a poem called The Poetry Reading, we might expect it to be about a poetry reading, but instead it is a depiction of this girl and her suffering, and that becomes the sort of performance of the poem. The next one I'm going to read you, Can You Hear Me?, is much more sort of overtly about performance, but it definitely is still bringing in these elements of Indigenous suffering and the suffering of Indigenous women in particular. So this is Can You Hear Me? Powdered woman in the front row, your plucked eyebrows creased with concern. Look at me, diseased, scarred with smallpox, seeping gonorrhea, lungs smothered with TB, drunk, pushed into a sewer, a reserve, the weed-choked backyard you never walk through. Listen. I speak of a history pieced with a jigsaw of flesh, torn from dumb tongues. Under my skin, blood beats along roadways barred with "Do Not Enter" signs, walls of small scars. I will not return to silence. Do you hear me? Hands twitter, you rise to your feet. Lovely, Miss Johnson, and will you have tea now, one lump or two? You dust biscuit from the corner of your mouth, and I remain on stage in front of you. I stare at the pelts hanging from my shoulder and sip from fine bone china. So this one I really like because in addition to that sort of component of performance, right? The expectations imposed on Indigenous peoples by settler colonialism, disease, drunkenness, scars, suffering, etc., etc., combined with the performance of that indigeneity, right? The second and third last lines, I stare at the pelts hanging from my shoulder, right? So one thing is that the presentation of indigeneity has been significantly shaped by settler colonial presuppositions, prejudices, biases, misinformation, etc., etc. And again, when indigeneity is performed, particularly, settler colonialists, white settler colonialists in particular, have particular sets of expectations of what that is going to look like. And they require that authenticity be performed according to the standards set by settler colonialists. And, wow, her name has just gone out of my head. I wrote a review of her book. Sorry, the name has escaped me, but there's a fairly new book out. I think it's about a year old now at time of filming. called Red Face, and it traces sort of the history of how the imagery of indigeneity has been constructed in a US particularly, but Canadian as well, context. And so this sort of idea of Indigenous people are expected to perform their indigeneity in particular ways that will align with the presuppositions, the standards, the conceptualizations of Anglo-European settler colonialists is a really sort of significant component of contemporary Indigenous culture and representation. Another component of contemporary Indigenous existence is the pervasiveness of ecological catastrophe and its impact on Indigenous people. Because Indigenous people, many Indigenous cultures, not all, but many within North America in particular, have deep ethical and ecological ties to the natural world. This was a sort of traditional value of many Indigenous cultures in which the human world, the natural world, the animal world, flora and fauna, and the spiritual world are all considered worthy of ethical consideration. And we have reciprocal responsibilities to each of those spheres. And so the importance of nature, the environment, et cetera, cannot really be understated, or can't really be overstated, I suppose. And so, again, we have in Crate's poetry these sort of ecological components, ecological devastation in particular, sort of mirroring personal loss or paralleling personal loss in a poem like Empty Seas, which is what I'm going to read to you now in case that wasn't clear. So, Empty Seas. Everything gone. But maybe next year, the fishermen say, salt ringing their sight, maybe a silver harvest will swell these lean seas. When we are hopeless, our hunger a crust on the low tide line, a dove, a gull, an albatross, will wheel through deep water skies, an omen, a sign of redemption, dear God, dear God. I no longer look for hope on this sad horizon. Since you died, Shawandit, they have forgotten you. I have all but forgotten you. Once I prayed that you escaped extinction, found a lover, delivered brown babies, 1 little, 2 little, 3 little. Some mornings I think I see you sleeping on the incoming tide, awaking to watch the cold shiver of our days. I've seen that book from the library, your sketches of waiting bridegrooms, of elders growing gray, children sifting sand, falling through their futures. I see the dry rot boats, the food bank volunteers in the abandoned cannery, the empty nets. I want to tell them all that it's all gone, that there will be no more fish, just scavenger birds slowly starving, an ocean of drought until we are all sea-changed, our bellies turned together toward a dying star, until we are immortal or wise or nothing, Shawandit, until we are all like you.